Yes and no.
So fucking nuts! Fuck!
All right. He says your guys are incredibly loyal toward you. They'll do anything you say. Lay down.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the movie The Equalizer from 2014. Robert McCall, a man of quiet routine and meticulously ordered life, worked at a large home improvement store, moving pallets with a practiced, almost somber efficiency. He was a study in self-imposed exile, his past a closely guarded secret, though the subtle tension in his shoulders hinted at skills far beyond shelving laminate flooring. His days were marked by the simple ritual of a midnight cup of tea at the same diner, a place where the waitress, Terry, a young woman trying to make ends meet while pursuing dreams of singing, felt like the only real connection he maintained. Terry, though vibrant and ambitious, was caught in the undertow of a dangerous situation. She was being exploited by low-level Russian gangsters, forced into transactional sex work under the coercion of a brute named Slavy. When McCall learned of the severity of her plight, how she'd been beaten badly after trying to quit, the dam holding back his former identity began to crack. He didn't confront the men with rage. He approached them with the cold, measured logic of an expert strategist. He visited Slavy's establishment, attempting a calm negotiation, offering the money Terry owed. But when his offer was scornfully rejected and he was told to leave, McCall knew discussion was over. The subsequent confrontation was swift and brutal, a stark demonstration of skills honed in a life he desperately tried to leave behind. He didn't just beat Slavy, he systematically dismantled him, using the environment, a screwdriver, the precise application of pressure, with an almost surgical detachment that belied the violence of the act. This act, however, brought unwanted attention. The local Russian syndicate, realizing they had crossed a professional, sent in a heavy hitter, Teddy Rusk, a man who treated violence as a corporate restructuring exercise. Rusk was tasked with cleaning up the mess and finding out who McCall was. McCall, meanwhile, was beginning to reconnect with the world he abandoned, reaching out to an old contact, Dave York, a former operative from his time in the Defense Intelligence Agency. York, now working private security, confirmed McCall's worst fears. The cleanup crew sent after him were not local thugs, but highly trained assassins, and the operation was far larger than a simple protection racket. McCall's past as a highly effective black ops cleaner, a man the government deployed when deniability was paramount, was resurfacing. As Rusk's investigation closed in, leading him to uncover McCall's service records and phantom identity, McCall preemptively dismantled the network targeting him. He moved through their security systems with the ease of someone navigating their own home turf, disabling surveillance, severing lines of communication, and exposing their financial corruption. The climax occurred at an active construction site, a towering symbol of progress and potential ruin. McCall lured Rusk and his remaining elite team into this unfinished skyscraper. It became a tactical playground where McCall, using shadows, elevation, and improvised weaponry, rebar, tools, the structure itself, systematically neutralized the assassins one by one. He didn't seek to kill them quickly. He sought to enforce consequence, making each death fit the crime they represented. The final confrontation with Rusk was personal, a clash of two men utterly dedicated to their violent professions. McCall, though older, possessed an unmatched clarity of purpose derived from his sudden, if reluctant, rediscovery of moral obligation. After disabling Rusk, McCall left him for the authorities, ensuring that the paper trail he'd established would implicate the highest levels of the corrupt organization. In the aftermath, McCall returned to his quiet life, his ledger balanced for now. He checked in on Terry, ensuring she was safe and equipped to pursue her singing career independently, dropping a substantial envelope of cash, money he had acquired through necessity, not theft, to secure her future. He then returned to the familiar rhythm of his existence, a ghost once more, satisfied that he had provided the justice the flawed system could not, before disappearing back into the mundane tapestry of the everyday. Robert McCall was a man meticulously constructing a facade of normalcy, each action a deliberate step away from the shadows of his former life. His job at the big box store, pushing pallets, was penance, a way to earn small, honest dollars that contrasted sharply with the lethal efficiency he once deployed on behalf of agencies that preferred their dirty work to remain untraceable. He carried himself with a stillness that wasn't peaceful, but coiled, like a tightly wound spring waiting for a specific, necessary tension to release it. Terry was the unintended catalyst, a beacon of fragile hope in the grim urban landscape. Her aspirations, the smoky, hopeful sound of her voice, trying to cut through the din of cheap bars, represented the kind of pure pursuit McCall felt he'd forfeited long ago. When he saw the bruising, the resignation in her eyes that went beyond mere exhaustion, something deep inside the retired operative recognized a familiar pattern of exploitation that official channels ignored. He was not just helping a girl, he was confronting the very chaos he'd spent years suppressing within himself. His initial visit to the Russian operation was not a moment of blind rage, but of calculated protocol adherence gone wrong. McCall, trained to neutralize threats with minimum collateral damage, offered a professional settlement. When Slavy, fueled by petty arrogance and misplaced loyalty to his superiors, scoffed at the offer and displayed contempt for Terry's suffering, the professional boundary dissolved. The subsequent scene in the cramped room was a demonstration of applied physics and anatomy, the shattering of a clavicle with a well-placed elbow, the methodical breaking of bones with a power tool. Each strike was precise, economical, and utterly devastating. He wasn't enjoying the violence. He was executing a difficult, necessary repair job on a broken system. Teddy Rusk, the cleanup specialist, was McCall's dark mirror. Rusk treated termination with the detached professionalism of a corporate auditor, his goal not vengeance, but operational security. He admired the work left behind at Slavi's site precisely because it signaled the involvement of someone who understood precision, a ghost from the same era of covert warfare. Rusk approached the investigation like an intelligence puzzle, tracing the anomalies in the system back to the source, the man who officially did not exist. McCall's re-engagement with Dave York was steeped in the unspoken language of long-dormant colleagues. York, whose life was now paved with high-end security contracts, saw the fear in McCall's eyes, the look of a man who thought he'd successfully buried his past only to find it digging its way out. The confirmation that this wasn't just about petty crime, but a systemic threat emanating from elements McCall himself had once policed, forced him fully back into the role he'd sworn off. He wasn't seeking action. Action was seeking him, demanding resolution. The preparation phase was a masterpiece of counter-surveillance. McCall didn't hack the systems. He understood their logic, moving through the digital landscape with the same invisibility he moved through physical darkness. He systematically crippled the syndicate's ability to coordinate, turning their reliance on technology into a vulnerability. The final act, staged in the skeleton of a high-rise under construction, was McCall's return to his element. He navigated the scaffolding and concrete beams as if they were familiar terrain. The battle against Rusk's remaining men wasn't a brawl. It was a series of chess moves played out across 3 dimensions. He used the environment brilliantly, dropping debris, using hanging wires as trip hazards, turning the tools of honest labor into instruments of swift judgment. Facing Rusk, McCall exhibited a cold certainty. Rusk fought with the efficiency of a hired gun. McCall fought with the moral imperative of a man correcting an existential error. When Rusk was finally broken, McCall didn't linger. He ensured the evidence was planted, the right names tagged, the paper trail leading up the hierarchy, so that the bureaucratic machine Rusk served would choke on its own corruption. Leaving the scene, the quiet satisfaction wasn't triumphant. It was the quiet relief of a burden momentarily lifted. His final gesture toward Terry, ensuring her financial stability and safety, an anonymous patron of her artistic endeavor, was the only true atonement he could offer. He walked back into the pre-dawn streets, not as a hero but as a necessary correction, melting seamlessly back into the anonymity from which he'd been unwillingly drawn. The world had one less pocket of danger, and Robert McCall, the man who always balanced the scales, was once again just a shadow waiting for his next cup of tea. McCall's existence before Terry was a monochrome existence, defined by routine designed to prevent thought. He inventoried supplies at the Home Mart with the same dedication he once used to inventory potential hostile assets. The meticulous arrangement of items on shelves mirrored the rigid control he exerted over his own internal landscape, an attempt to keep the ghosts of countless classified extractions firmly locked away. He sought out the mundane because the mundane could not be killed, could not be compromised. Terry, however, possessed a raw vulnerability that bypassed his defenses. When he saw her in the diner, her eyes shadowed not just by lack of sleep, but by genuine fear, the routine faltered. He observed her, not with romantic interest, but with the detached assessment of a security analyst noting a critical system failure. Her singing wasn't polished, but it was honest, a sound untainted by the bureaucratic deceit that had defined his career in the DIA's clandestine operations unit. That honesty demanded protection, a task he hadn't officially undertaken in years. The confrontation with Slavi wasn't about the Russian mob's territory. It was about the sanctity of an individual's right to self-determination, a right McCall believed he had forfeited, but saw in Terry's desperate plea. When he entered the back room, his mind mapped the exit routes, the potential weapons. the rusted shelving, the heavy toolbox. Slavi's casual cruelty, his refusal to see Terry as anything more than chattel, ignited a cold fury that bypassed adrenaline and went straight to operational necessity. The use of the power drill, not as a weapon of torture, but as a shocking tool for dismantling resistance, reflected McCall's philosophy. Efficiency over spectacle. He wasn't acting out. He was conducting a precise surgical removal of a toxic element. Teddy Rusk arrived like a plague specialist. He wasn't driven by anger, but by professional insult. A ghost had resurfaced, one who knew the protocols Rusk himself followed. Rusk's career was built on meticulous pattern recognition, tracing footprints left in the dark. When he found the remnants of Slavi's demise, Rusk recognized the signature. Highly specialized neutralization, suggesting a deep background, a man who operated under the banner of deniable assets. Rusk reveled in the hunt, viewing McCall as the ultimate professional challenge, the ghost he was tasked to exorcise permanently. The reconnection with York was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. They hadn't spoken since McCall walked away, faking his death to escape the moral compromises of their final assignments. York, now insulated by wealth and corporate contracts, still lived close to the line. Their brief meeting was a coded exchange, a shared understanding that the past, when left untended, invariably sends assassins. York provided the intel, the depth of the organization's reach, confirming that McCall was facing not just thugs, but men with high-level government access, the kind of people McCall used to train. McCall's strategy was one of calculated retreat into his former self. He began stripping away the syndicate's infrastructure methodically. He targeted their communication nodes, knowing that organized violence relies utterly on centralized command. He moved through their safe houses with the quiet confidence of ownership, demonstrating that his skills had not dulled with time, merely been refined by restraint. The final showdown amidst the steel skeleton of the skyscraper was McCall weaponizing the architecture itself. He used the echoing acoustics to disorient, the sheer drop to intimidate. He was a predator utilizing elevation, turning rebar into spears and concrete dust into blinding cover. Each takedown was narrated by the environment. One operative crushed under a falling sheet of drywall, another cleanly dispatched with a heavy chain hoist. It was a demonstration of environmental mastery, a final, stark performance for an audience of shadows. When he finally faced Rusk, the fight was less about physical dominance and more about ideological defeat. Rusk fought for structure and control. McCall fought for the singular, undeniable value of human life. After Rusk was neutralized, left broken but alive to face the legal fallout he so despised, McCall ensured the evidence, the logs, the transactions, was routed to the correct, if slow, federal offices. It was a final act of faith in a system he otherwise despised. His departure was silent, leaving behind only the quiet settling of dust and the knowledge that for Terry, at least, the ledger was finally clear. He didn't seek praise, he sought the return of silence, the only true reward for a man who had once been the ultimate fixer. The return to the mundane was always the hardest transition. McCall drove his modest car back across the city limits, the setting sun catching the grime on his windshield, mimicking the dust of the construction site he'd just vacated. He sought out the anonymity of his small Spartan apartment, a space intentionally devoid of personal touches, a temporary holding cell until his presence became too noticeable. The adrenaline, which had served him so well in its controlled application, began to recede, leaving behind a profound, echoing exhaustion, not the tiredness of physical labor, but the spiritual fatigue of having embraced the monster he swore to contain. He knew the lull wouldn't last. The ripples from the chaos he created would reach the higher echelons of the organization he'd dismantled, men who relied on layers of insulation between themselves and the mess. They wouldn't see the justice in his actions. They would only register the expense of the cleanup and the exposure of their network. For McCall, the immediate concern was Terry. He couldn't simply disappear without ensuring her path forward was unhindered by the lingering threat of retaliation. His subsequent visits were conducted under deep cover, utilizing the tradecraft drilled into him during decades of operating in hostile zones. He observed Terry from a distance, confirming that the money he'd left was secured and that she was actively pursuing auditions, the fear in her eyes slowly being replaced by the tentative light of self-determination. He saw her talking to a manager, her voice stronger, less hesitant. This small victory, earned through terrible necessity, was the anchor that kept him tethered to a semblance of humanity. It was the only payment he valued. McCall then focused on erasing the residual markers of his brief return. He meticulously checked the safe spots he'd used, the communication dead drops, ensuring no digital or physical trace remained that could link the Robert McCall of the home improvement store to the phantom operative who decimated the syndicate. This final sweep was as critical as the initial takedowns. A single loose end could unravel the fragile piece he had purchased. He handled the few remaining pieces of equipment he'd used, a specialized lockpicking set, a burner phone, disposing of them in deep, untraceable ways, dispersing the physical remnants across multiple jurisdictions. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection while waiting at the familiar diner, hours later than his usual midnight tea time. The waitress, perhaps sensing a change in his usual gravity, offered him a fresh cup without being asked. McCall looked out the window, the city lights blurring into indistinct smears of color. He was a man who had tasted freedom, only to find that his skill set made genuine freedom impossible. His commitment wasn't to a flag or an agency anymore. It was to the principle of ensuring that the vulnerable were not consumed by the predators that operated just outside the view of the law. With his immediate obligations fulfilled, the coiled tension in his shoulders began to relax fractionally. He finished his tea, left a generous tip, and stepped back into the vast, indifferent anonymity of the night, ready to resume the quiet performance of an ordinary, unremarkable man, awaiting the next time the broken scales demanded correction. The vacuum left by McCall's decisive action began to pull in unwanted attention from unexpected quarters. While the street-level syndicate was in shambles, its corporate sponsors, the unseen hands that had leveraged the operation for illicit finance, were now conducting their own internal audit. They didn't send assassins. They deployed bureaucrats and investigators, men who understood the art of burying bodies under paperwork. McCall, having anticipated this, had already set his final trap, a slow-acting poison aimed at the infrastructure itself. His efforts to remain unseen were paradoxically made easier by his previous life. Years spent operating in the deep background meant he understood how government and corporate entities sought to explain away anomalies. He purposefully left behind certain breadcrumbs, faint trails leading not to his identity, but to a deliberately crafted narrative. That the entire operation had been compromised by an internal leak within the Russian organization itself, a narrative designed to discourage a full federal investigation that might accidentally stumble upon his own ghosts. The lingering emotion wasn't pride, but a chilling sense of duty fulfilled, a grim satisfaction reserved for those who navigate moral quicksand. He observed the ripples from afar, using old, untraceable satellite feeds he still maintained for personal security checks. He noted the sudden disappearance of certain offshore accounts and the resignation of mid-level managers connected to the defunct operation. It was a quieter form of victory, one measured in regulatory filings rather than bullet casings, and it suited his current need for near invisibility. McCall visited the Home Mart one final time, not to work, but to resign. He didn't utilize the formal channels. He simply walked into his manager's office, an expressionless mask in place, and stated his departure, effective immediately. The manager, intimidated by the sheer, contained stillness of the man who usually only stocked shelves, barely offered resistance, viewing it as the eccentricity of an older employee finally cracking under the strain. McCall collected his final paycheck, a small stack of crisp bills, and methodically wiped down his workstation, a final act of decontamination. His interaction with Terry became more infrequent, transitioning from active protection to distant oversight. He drove by her new apartment complex, noting the security gates and the better lighting, a small, tangible measure of improvement. He saw her once, leaving in a well-maintained vehicle, presumably heading to a better venue. There was a brief moment where their eyes might have met across the street, a flash of acknowledgement in the shared knowledge of the terrible debt paid. But McCall averted his gaze first, respecting the boundaries he'd fought so hard to re-establish. He could not become her guardian angel. He could only be the silent force that cleared the immediate storm. The solace he sought was in the act of erasure. He drove hundreds of miles away from the city, where the violence had erupted, trading the tight confines of urban surveillance for the vast, impersonal openness of the American West. He settled for now in a small, forgotten town where the rhythms of life were slow and the reliance on technology minimal. He took a job doing manual labor on a ranch, the kind of exhausting, sun-beaten work that demanded total physical presence, leaving no mental space for spectral threats or past transgressions. Here, under a sky unpolluted by city haze, McCall began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding his internal architecture. He exchanged the controlled violence of his former life for the relentless, honest labor of the earth. He was a man defined now not by the missions he accepted, but by the peace he desperately sought to maintain, a peace bought at the cost of tremendous, violent exertion, and one he knew could shatter at any moment should the scales of justice tip too far out of balance again. He was waiting, not for a call, but for the simple, beautiful absence of one. The ranch provided a temporary balm, a wide-open space where secrets struggled to hold their form against the relentless wind and sun. McCall found a strange rhythm in mending fences and working the unforgiving soil. The exhaustion was clean, earned through honest sweat, a stark contrast to the corrosive fatigue of clandestine combat. He learned the names of the local ranch hands, speaking only when necessary, his voice roughened by disuse and the dry air. His movements, though still economical, lacked the lethal coiled tension of the city. They were instead the measured motions of a man conserving energy for a long haul. Yet, the past was not merely a set of memories. It was a residual energy field that clung to him. He remained vigilant, not against immediate threats. The nearest potential adversary was days away by car, but against the insidious nature of his own expertise. He established perimeter checks around his small rented cabin with the same discipline he once used to secure black sites. His supplies were minimal, bought in cash, his interactions brief and strictly transactional. He understood that true anonymity was not about hiding, but about being utterly unremarkable in a setting where eccentricity was quickly noted. One evening, while sitting on the porch watching the spectacular, indifferent sprawl of the Milky Way, McCall allowed himself a flicker of acknowledgement for Terry. He had occasionally searched obscure online music forums, careful not to use any traceable network, just to confirm her progress. He found a review of a small-time club gig where a singer named Teresa was praised for her raw, soulful delivery. The review mentioned her new, focused energy. That small validation was enough to quiet the persistent nagging of professional responsibility. He had corrected the imbalance. He did not need to manage the consequences forever. His focus shifted entirely to preservation of the present silence. He studied the local ecosystem, noting the patterns of wildlife, learning when the nearest sheriff patrolled, absorbing the ambient data of his new environment. He was actively cultivating a life where the sudden need to dismantle an enemy cell would be completely incongruous with his surroundings. The man who once moved armies through coded communication was now focused on the precise tension required to keep a barbed wire fence upright against a winter storm. However, a quiet unease began to settle in. It wasn't a direct threat, but a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure. One afternoon, while repairing a tractor miles from the main ranch house, he noticed a set of tire tracks on a seldom-used dirt access road. Fresh tracks belonging to a vehicle far too expensive and well-maintained for this area. They were professional, measured tracks, not the haphazard marks of a lost tourist. They indicated surveillance, slow and methodical. McCall didn't panic. He didn't immediately grab the emergency cash he kept buried near the creek. Instead, he observed, returning to the ranch with a detached curiosity. Someone, likely a lingering element from the Russian cleanup crews network, or perhaps the government entities Rusk's men had been protecting, was tracing the final loose end. They hadn't forgotten the professional who had caused such spectacular damage to their operation. They were applying the corporate philosophy Rusk admired: clean up the entire liability, down to the lowest denominator. McCall looked at the vast, empty horizon. The quiet life, it seemed, was only ever a temporary lease, paid for in violence and subject to immediate recall. He knew the drill. He would not run. Running admitted guilt and created panic. Instead, he began to prepare his departure, packing the necessities. He left a note for the ranch foreman, brief and apologetic, citing an unforeseen family emergency, the eternal vague excuse of the man who has no family. He looked back at the landscape, a momentary pang for the hard-won peace, and then turned toward the road, anticipating the inevitable clash that would occur when the shadows he thought he'd escaped finally caught up to him in the open daylight. The Equalizer was back in business, not by choice but by necessity. The approach of the investigators, even in this remote, dusty corner of the world, carried the same chilling signature as the high-stakes operations McCall had fled: methodical, professional, and utterly without personal malice. These weren't thugs looking for a fight. They were auditors dispatched to close a ledger. McCall recognized the vehicle tracks as belonging to a high-end, unmarked surveillance unit, suggesting the involvement of entities that preferred deniability even in their pursuit of him. The quiet ranch life had merely been a pause button, not an off switch. He spent the next 24 hours in a state of heightened, yet outwardly calm, readiness. There was no frantic packing. Instead, he performed a ritualistic inventory of his hidden resources, the discreetly cached tools, the reliable sidearm he kept disassembled and oiled, and the small stash of international currency. His emotions were flat, stripped down to pure operational focus. This was the dance he knew best, and ironically, the only place he felt truly competent. He felt a familiar cold certainty settling in, a sense that the universe was demanding a rebalancing act, and he was the designated instrument. He left the ranch cabin untouched, save for one detail. He removed the few books he'd acquired, a history of early American architecture, a volume of Emerson, and left them neatly stacked on a small table, perhaps as a fleeting testament to the life he had briefly attempted to claim. The note to the foreman, placed under a stone, was deliberately vague, designed to stall any immediate alarm. He did not look back at the landscape. Lingering created sentimental attachments, and sentiment was a vulnerability he could no longer afford. McCall chose his exit route not by road, but by navigating the natural terrain, utilizing gullies and ridge lines that broke up any potential aerial or long-range visual tracking. His goal was to reach a seldom-used junction point where a regional bus line stopped, a place that offered the anonymity of transient travelers. He moved with the practiced grace of an apex predator, conserving energy, his body functioning on muscle memory, forged in years of black operations where failure meant erasure. As he approached the junction point, he saw them, two men leaning against a nondescript black SUV, ostensibly waiting for someone, but their posture, too rigid, too observant, betrayed their purpose. They wore the casual but expensive attire of corporate security, men trained to blend in until the moment of necessary engagement. They were Rusk's successors, perhaps even the same specialized team dispatched by the remnants of the intelligence contacts McCall had once overlapped with. McCall didn't attempt to bypass them in the open. He used the high scrub brush and the slight drop in elevation to his advantage, circling wide until he had the terrain mapped and a clear line of sight to their vehicle. His plan crystallized instantly. He needed to create chaos and secure transport without engaging in a protracted firefight that would draw unwanted local attention. He didn't carry explosives, but he carried knowledge. From his small pack, he retrieved a handful of ball bearings and a small specialized electronic disruptor. He tossed the ball bearings near the rear passenger side of the SUV, timed precisely as he activated the disruptor, sending a targeted, high-frequency pulse that temporarily overloaded the vehicle's ignition system and anti-theft alarms. The resultant sporadic blaring and flashing lights drew the attention of the two men instantly, causing them to break their surveillance stance and move toward the noise. In that fleeting moment of distraction, McCall moved. He burst from cover, not toward the men, but toward the driver's side door, yanked it open, and slid into the driver's seat. He didn't need to engage them directly. He just needed separation. As the first investigator turned back, realizing the ruse, McCall jammed the SUV into gear, slamming the accelerator. The vehicle fishtailed violently on the dirt road, kicking up a massive, blinding cloud of dust and gravel directly into the faces of his pursuers. He drove hard toward the main highway, the powerful engine a stark contrast to the rusted pickups he'd been driving. This wasn't a return to his old life. It was simply the initiation of the next phase of survival. As he merged onto the interstate, heading east, away from the coast and toward the vast interior of the continent, McCall felt a grim sense of inevitability. The Equalizer never truly retired. He only relocated until the debt collectors arrived. He adjusted the rearview mirror, not to look behind, but to check his own reflection, the face of a man resigned to perpetually balancing the scales, one violent intervention at a time. McCall drove the stolen SUV with the efficiency of a man reclaiming a necessary tool, not a carjacker. The vehicle itself, a symbol of the organized, well-funded network pursuing him, was now simply a means of escape, its sophisticated tracking systems already rendered moot by the quick, focused pulse of his electronic countermeasure. He pushed the vehicle hard, letting the raw speed offer a momentary psychological buffer against the knowledge that he was now truly exposed, the illusion of quiet retirement shattered by two men with expensive sunglasses and a faulty alarm system. His immediate destination wasn't a safe house, but an old contact he hadn't intended to use, a logistical specialist named Ernie, who operated out of a surprisingly legitimate-looking trucking depot in a forgotten corner of the Midwest. Ernie was a man McCall had worked with during the DIA's most deniable operations, a master of paperwork, forged documents, and disappearing assets. Ernie's loyalty wasn't moral. It was purely transactional, based on the understanding that McCall always paid his debts and always ensured the cleanup was thorough. The rendezvous with Ernie was tense, conducted beneath the cavernous, echoing darkness of an empty loading bay. Ernie, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the fatigue of 1,000 late nights staring at customs manifests, barely looked up as McCall laid out his requirements. New identification that could withstand a high-level audit, a clean vehicle untraceable to the SUV he'd abandoned, and a rapid dispersal plan that put him across at least 2 state lines within 12 hours. "You didn't just stir the pot, Robert," Ernie murmured, his voice raspy as he shuffled through laminated sheets of blank identification paper. "You dumped the whole pot onto the floor. They are moving fast. Not the Russians this time. This smells like the official side protecting their own threats." McCall confirmed this assessment with a single nod. He wasn't running from common criminals. He was running from the very machinery of state secrecy he once served, the system that needed ghosts to remain undisturbed. He provided Ernie with the necessary funding, repurposed emergency cash from his past operations, untraceable bearer bonds, ensuring Ernie would be rewarded handsomely for the risk. As Ernie worked, McCall used the depot's weak, isolated Wi-Fi connection to perform a final, necessary reconnaissance. He scanned publicly available records for any mention of Rusk's unit, seeking any digital scar tissue left behind. He discovered that Teddy Rusk had, in fact, been deeply connected to a private military contractor that specialized in asset retrieval for various shadowy governmental contracts. Rusk's team hadn't just been cleaning up Russian debt. They were protecting the infrastructure that allowed those foreign elements to operate in the first place. McCall hadn't just stopped a crime. He'd severed a vital artery in a vast, state-sanctioned compromise. The weight of this realization was heavy. His actions were not isolated acts of vigilante justice. They were acts of war against the covert establishment he had once been a part of. He felt no thrill, only the grim confirmation that his path back to peace was entirely closed off. When Ernie handed him a new identity, a quiet, unremarkable man named Michael Wells, with a history as a long-haul HVAC technician, McCall accepted it with the practiced ease of slipping into a well-worn suit. The new documentation was flawless, possessing the necessary weight to pass cursory checks. "Where to, Michael?" Ernie asked, handing him a set of new truck keys. McCall looked at the map Ernie had spread out, a crisscross of highways leading toward the vast, sparsely populated areas of the mountain states. "Somewhere where the noise doesn't carry," he replied, his voice adopting the slightly flatter, more neutral cadence of his new persona. He left the trucking depot before dawn, driving a sturdy, anonymous transport truck that blended seamlessly into the early morning flow of commercial traffic. He wasn't aiming for a new job at a ranch this time. He was aiming for complete, unobservable latency. He settled into the long, monotonous stretches of highway, the landscape blurring into an endless canvas of gray and brown. Robert McCall was gone. Michael Wells was the next ghost, tasked only with survival and the grim, constant readiness to become the Equalizer once more, should the necessary imbalance present itself, even in the most remote silence. The anonymity of the long-haul truck offered a false sense of security, a massive metal shell that, while concealing Michael Wells, also announced his presence as a commercial entity moving across the nation. McCall found the relentless, humming monotony of the highway strangely therapeutic. It was structure without obligation, a physical journey replacing the internal one he had failed to complete back in the city. He drove in shifts that stretched the limits of human endurance, fueled by stale coffee and the necessity of distance. He was acutely aware that the people pursuing him operated on a different frequency. They didn't need to know where he was, they just needed to know where he would go. Their methods, he knew from experience, involved leveraging financial markers, airline manifests, and the subtle pressure of informants placed along major transit corridors. His strategy, therefore, was to embrace the unremarkable chaos of commerce, becoming just another cog in the massive, faceless logistics machine of America. His brief stop in a sprawling truck stop in rural Oklahoma was illustrative of his new existence. He moved through the crowded diner with deliberate slowness, observing the genuine exhaustion of the working drivers. He ate a standard high-calorie meal, paying with cash dispensed from his new emergency fund. He engaged in no conversation, offering only curt acknowledgments when addressed. He was practicing invisibility, the art of being so thoroughly average that the eye slides right over him. It was during this stop that the echo of his past life manifested in a minor but significant way. While waiting for his vehicle to be serviced, a pre-planned stop under the guise of routine maintenance, he noticed a small old woman struggling to lift a heavy bag of dog food into the trunk of her sedan. The instinct, deeply ingrained, flared. It was the same reflex that compelled him to protect Terry, the need to correct a small, visible injustice. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. To act was to break the performance of Michael Wells. To not act was to betray the core compulsion that made him who he was, even under a new name. He chose a middle ground. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he casually walked past the trunk, appearing preoccupied with a ringing payphone, a prop he was using to maintain the illusion of being on a work call. As he passed, his arm swung slightly outward, seemingly carelessly, and the heavy bag of dog food was effortlessly shifted and placed inside the trunk with minimal visible effort. He kept walking toward the phone booth, resuming his monologue about delivery delays and manifest errors. The woman, startled by the sudden movement, looked up, finding only the back of a generic, burly trucker walking away. She checked her trunk, saw the bag securely placed, and shook her head, attributing the event to misplaced memory or simple good luck. McCall hung up the prop phone after a moment, his expression unchanged. He had satisfied the compulsion without compromising his cover. It was a calculated risk, a minor expenditure of energy to maintain his moral baseline. If he stopped performing these small corrections, he feared the cold, calculating machine of his old life would consume the remnant of the man he wanted to be. As he settled back into the driver's seat of the big rig, merging back onto the highway, heading west toward the relative obscurity of the mountain passes, he knew the pursuit would tighten. The men looking for him wouldn't be deterred by a blown alarm system or a changed vehicle. They would be applying predictive modeling, looking for patterns in logistics flow, searching for the one man who moves with too much purpose and too little error. He was heading toward the quiet, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that the quiet would not last. The scales, even in the barren expanse of the American West, would inevitably tilt again. The vast, empty stretches of the American interior offered a deceptive solitude. McCall, now inhabiting the persona of Michael Wells, found that the sheer scale of the landscape made surveillance harder to maintain, yet the need for vigilance remained absolute. The diesel engine's rhythmic drone became his metronome, marking time between one potential confrontation and the next. He navigated the complex web of interstate commerce, using trucker-specific communication channels not for illicit dealings, but to absorb ambient intelligence, gossip about unusual roadblocks, shifts in law enforcement presence, or the sudden appearance of unmarked vehicles trailing commercial traffic. He understood that his pursuers, likely those high-level contractors who had employed Rusk, possessed resources far exceeding local law enforcement. They operated with the patience of corporate entities, willing to invest significant time and capital to neutralize a liability that threatened their shadowy operations. McCall's previous success in exposing parts of their network meant they weren't just hunting a rogue agent, they were hunting a data leak made flesh. His infrequent stops became exercises in counter-profiling. In a dusty diner near the Colorado border, while ostensibly checking manifests, he ran a brief, encrypted diagnostic on the truck's onboard satellite system. He discovered a highly sophisticated, low-frequency beacon subtly integrated into the vehicle's GPS unit, installed not at the depot, but likely during the brief time the SUV was in the hands of the investigators. It was a dead man's switch, designed to activate once the vehicle crossed a certain geographical threshold or remained stationary for too long. The realization was sobering. Ernie, despite his professionalism, might have been compromised, or the initial sweep was far more thorough than anticipated. McCall didn't curse Ernie. He simply accepted the imperfection of human security. He had to destroy the beacon without causing a visible malfunction that would alert the tracking system to its own failure. Working in the cramped confines of the sleeper cab late one night, under the weak glow of a battery-powered lamp, McCall used micro-tools disguised as electrical repair implements. He isolated the beacon, recognizing the specific signature of military-grade encryption. With painstaking precision, he didn't destroy the component, which might trigger an alarm, but rather rerouted its signal to loop endlessly into a null destination, a digital black hole where the tracking signal would report its location as perpetually moving in a tight, meaningless circle 20 miles back along the route he had already traveled. It was deception layered upon deception. The emotional toll of this constant maneuvering was manifesting subtly. McCall found himself sleeping less, not out of fear, but out of a hyper-awareness that made true rest feel like an abdication of duty. He started sketching again in a small hidden notebook, not plans for violence, but detailed architectural drawings of the structures he passed: bridges, silos, abandoned industrial parks. It was a mental exercise in control, recreating tangible, ordered spaces in his mind when the world outside remained fluid and treacherous. He decided to leave the major highways entirely. The interstate system was a roadmap for his enemies. He turned the heavy truck onto a rarely used state road winding deep into the desolate terrain of Utah. Here the silence was real, the only evidence of life being the occasional skeletal remains of old mining operations. He was seeking friction, a place where movement was difficult, slowing down both himself and any potential mechanized pursuit. He didn't know how long he could sustain this existence, constantly shedding identities and vehicles. But as he looked out at the stark, beautiful desolation, a truth solidified. The fight wasn't about eliminating threats anymore. It was about proving that his commitment to quiet justice, the only life he could truly live, was more resourceful than the corrupt power structures he opposed. He was the necessary counterforce, existing in the negative space between their control. The road ahead was long, dusty, and silent, but McCall knew that silence, when truly earned, was the most powerful weapon of all. The 2014 film The Equalizer, directed by Antoine Fuqua, presents a stark, often brutal, exploration of vigilante justice wrapped in the familiar narrative skin of a former operative dragged back into the life he desperately tried to leave behind. This is not merely an action film. It is a character study focused on Robert McCall, played with meticulous, simmering intensity by Denzel Washington, a man whose outward demeanor as a quiet, unassuming hardware store employee masks a terrifyingly efficient past as a black operations agent for the Defense Intelligence Agency. McCall's current existence in suburban Boston, is defined by routine. Working diligently, reading classic literature, and frequenting a 24-hour diner where he engages in stilted, gentle conversation with Terry, a young woman working as a prostitute. Terry, portrayed by Chloe Grace Moretz, represents the last thread connecting McCall to the possibility of a normal, passive life. Her vulnerability, coupled with the vicious abuse she suffers at the hands of the Russian mafia. Figures controlling her, specifically Teddy, an enforcer for the organization, acts as the catalyst. McCall's inherent, deeply ingrained moral code, which demands the protection of the innocent, cannot tolerate this injustice. His defining line, "I'm going to help her," is not a request or a suggestion. It is a statement of inevitable action. Washington embodies a specific kind of cinematic heroism, one rooted in disciplined experience rather than raw adrenaline. His background, implied to be filled with morally ambiguous government assignments, suggests a man who has spent years executing orders without question. The transition shown in the film is not about him learning to fight. It's about him choosing who to fight for. The meticulous nature of his violence mirrors his past training. When he first confronts the Russian thugs in the fish market, the scene is choreographed less as a brawl and more as a precise, rapid-fire surgical operation. He uses the environment, the metal rods, the proximity to the ice, with an almost clinical detachment, concluding the confrontation in seconds. This immediate, overwhelming display of capability serves to establish the stakes. If McCall engages, the odds are overwhelmingly stacked against his opponents. The narrative deepens as the Russian syndicate, led by the calculatedly cold overlord Pushkin, fails to understand the nature of the man they have provoked. Their attempts to intimidate or bribe McCall are met with contempt. His decision to systematically dismantle their operations, starting with exposing their corruption and then systematically eliminating key personnel, is methodical. He doesn't seek glory, he seeks equilibrium. This pursuit of balance is central to his characterization. He is the equalizer, because he perceives the world as fundamentally unbalanced by predatory behavior, and he possesses the unique skill set to correct that imbalance, often sacrificing his own peace in the process. The introduction of Susan Plummer, played by Melissa Leo, McCall's former colleague and handler, adds necessary texture to his past. Plummer serves as his reluctant link back to the intelligence community. Her concern is palpable. She understands the depth of the organization McCall is awakening and the danger that trails him. Her presence allows for exposition regarding McCall's fabricated death and his subsequent desire to fade away, a desire now clearly proven unattainable as long as evil exists in his immediate vicinity. The final act escalates the conflict to a direct confrontation with Teddy, the primary architect of Terry's suffering. Teddy himself is portrayed as a highly trained operative, making him a worthy, albeit ultimately insufficient, antagonist for McCall. Their final showdown, taking place in an unfinished, cavernous home improvement store, a setting ironically mirroring McCall's current, mundane employment, is a testament to Fuqua's visual style. The darkness, the scattered debris, and the improvised weaponry turn the space into McCall's personal theater of retribution. McCall wins not just through superior skill, but through an unwavering commitment to his self-imposed mission. Ultimately, the Equalizer succeeds because it anchors its action sequences in the psychological weight carried by its protagonist. Denzel Washington portrays a man who understands that true retirement is impossible for someone with his specific talents and sense of justice. He is haunted by his past actions in service of a flawed system, and now he dedicates himself to a personal, far purer form of service, one act of extreme violence at a time, believing that in righting these specific wrongs, he might find a measure of personal peace, even if that peace is fleeting and always followed by the next call for help. The film's genius lies in contrasting McCall's hyper-competence with his deeply suppressed yearning for ordinariness. His adherence to routine, the specific amount of tea, the precise stacking of tools, the quiet contemplation of Tolstoy or Camus, is a form of self-imposed penance, an attempt to build a cage of normalcy around the coiled readiness within him. When he meticulously prepares his tools for the confrontation at the fish market, timing the snap of a plastic bag to create a makeshift restraint, it's not flair. It's survival strategy honed over years of necessary brutality. The emotional toll of this internal dichotomy is visible in Washington's eyes. A profound, exhausted sadness that suggests every act of violence he commits is another nail in the coffin of the life he actually desires. Terry, or the idea of Terry, serves as McCall's moral mirror. She is young, trapped, and possesses a fragile hope, contrasting sharply with McCall's hardened cynicism. Her decision to leave the life, which the Russians violently crush, forces McCall to confront the reality that passive withdrawal from evil simply allows it to metastasize elsewhere. His initial conversation with her in the diner is fraught with unspoken tension. He sees not just a victim, but a reflection of the helplessness he once felt under the orders of others. When he tells her, "You walk away from something like that, you can't just go back to the way things were," he is simultaneously advising her and justifying his own inability to achieve true erasure from his past. The Russian organization, characterized by Pushkin's detached, corporate approach to human trafficking, functions as the perfect external representation of the abstract evils McCall fought during his DIA tenure. They are faceless until Teddy is introduced. Teddy, in his arrogance and belief in his own elite training, represents the type of operative McCall once was, or perhaps feared becoming. Someone who weaponizes skill without conscience. Their encounters are less about a physical struggle and more about a clash of operational philosophies. McCall operates outside the system, unburdened by bureaucracy or surveillance, making him unpredictable. Teddy relies on predictable hierarchies and chain of command, which McCall systematically severs. The influence of Fuqua's direction is evident in the film's visual language, which often favors shadows and tight framing during moments of intense planning, opening up only slightly during the bursts of action. This controlled aesthetic reinforces McCall's mindset. Everything is compartmentalized, planned, and executed within strict parameters. The slow-motion counting sequences, where McCall mentally maps out angles, response times, and contingencies, are external manifestations of an internal processor running at maximum capacity. This isn't just a man fighting. It's a system optimizing itself for localized conflict resolution. When McCall meets with Plummer, the emotional weight of his history is laid bare. Plummer represents the institutional recognition of his worth, a validation he consciously rejects, but perhaps subconsciously craves. Her worry over his suicide attempt, faking his death to escape, underscores the finality of his decision to re-engage. He tells her he is done running, but the dialogue suggests that running was less about fear of capture and more about running from the inescapable obligation he feels toward employing his specialized existence. He is not escaping the law. He is escaping the quiet lie that he could ever be just Robert McCall, hardware store clerk. He finds a grim sort of authenticity only when he is actively balancing the scales, an emotional release achieved through violent, precise purpose. The film, therefore, concludes not with triumph, but with a profound, temporary resolution, anticipating the next time the world's inherent imbalance demands the attention of the Equalizer. The film's enduring resonance stems from how it refuses to romanticize the bloodshed, presenting McCall's competence as a heavy burden rather than a superpower. His precision is born of trauma and necessity. One sees this vividly in the scene, where he deliberately times his movements to the beat of the song playing in the diner, a conscious effort to ground himself in a controlled reality even as he prepares for chaos. This act is less about flair and more about an almost autistic need for rhythmic order in the face of moral anarchy. He is attempting to impose the quantifiable logic of his training onto the messy irrationality of criminal cruelty. The depiction of McCall's former life, while largely implied, speaks volumes about the moral vacuum of Black Ops. He served a machine, and now he serves his own conscience, a significant shift that fuels the narrative tension. While government work demands secrecy and plausible deniability, McCall's current actions are starkly visible, though often mistaken for random acts of violence by those investigating. This difference in visibility highlights his ultimate freedom. He's accountable only to the victims he chooses to save, a self-imposed form of atonement that the DIA could never offer. Teddy, as the primary agent sent to neutralize McCall, becomes the ultimate foil. He operates with a chilling sense of entitlement, embodying the corruption McCall is trying to excise from society. The intensity of their final confrontation is amplified because Teddy understands the system McCall escaped, yet fatally underestimates McCall's resolve to abandon that system entirely. When McCall rigs the wiring in the unfinished warehouse, utilizing the very construction environment to create traps, it's a deliberate inversion of his mundane day job. He takes the materials of honest labor and weaponizes them, symbolizing his complete immersion into the role of the rectifier. Furthermore, the peripheral characters, such as Dave York, McCall's former DIA colleague who has gone rogue and now works for the opposition, serve to underline the corrupting nature of the intelligence world. York's decision to sell his skills to the highest bidder demonstrates the slippery slope McCall narrowly avoided. When McCall confronts York, there is a shared history that adds a layer of tragic recognition to their fight. Two highly capable men, choosing fundamentally different paths in defining their post-service ethics. McCall chooses justice, divorced from mandate. York chooses profit. The emotional anchor of the film remains the quiet dignity McCall affords the powerless. His final moments with Terry, before he leaves Boston, are silent affirmations of his success. He didn't save her life in a literal, long-term sense. That burden is hers, but he restored her agency by eliminating the immediate threat. This subtle distinction is crucial. McCall is not a savior who fixes lives. He is an equalizer who removes obstacles so that others might have a chance to save themselves. His satisfaction is not derived from dominance, but from the temporary restoration of fairness, an understanding that tomorrow new injustices will arise, and he will likely be called upon again. The film closes not with triumph, but with the weary acceptance of an eternal duty. The film meticulously builds a world where systemic failure necessitates individual, extreme intervention. McCall's decision-making process, often shown through voice-over narration that is minimal yet highly resonant, reveals a philosophy forged in moral compromises made under duress. His dedication to reading classic literature, books that wrestle with fate, duty, and existential struggle, is not mere intellectual decoration. It suggests he is constantly attempting to find a philosophical framework to justify his violent existence. He seeks ancient wisdom to rationalize modern brutality. This internal dialogue separates him from standard action archetypes. He is burdened by the sheer weight of his ethical calculus. The dynamic between McCall and Susan Plummer is crucial because she represents the only person who truly understands the cost of his capability. Her reluctance to fully assist him stems from a professional fear of reigniting the very government apparatus that nearly destroyed him through secrecy and manipulation. When she provides him with the necessary intel, a key contact number, or an encrypted file, it is done with the deep-seated knowledge that she is signing off on a potential catastrophe, yet recognizing that letting the current evil stand is a greater one. Their exchanges are tinged with the unspoken acknowledgement of past missions where they likely crossed lines, suggesting that McCall's current actions are, paradoxically, a return to a pure, albeit more dangerous, form of fidelity to justice than his government service ever allowed. Fuqua ensures that the environments themselves participate in the narrative tension. The brightly lit, almost sterile environment of the hardware store during the day contrasts violently with the suffocating darkness of the warehouse in the climax. This visual grammar emphasizes that McCall is a creature of the margins. He functions best when operating in the shadows, where the rules of civil society no longer apply and only pure, lethal application of skill remains relevant. The tools of his legitimate trade, a hammer, rope, industrial adhesives, become instruments of judgment, turning the mundane into the menacing. The lack of a clear, immediate successor or a continuation arc in the first film is intentional. McCall's mission is inherently cyclical and localized. He is not aiming to dismantle global crime syndicates, but to address the immediate, tangible suffering he encounters. This granular focus grounds the extraordinary nature of his abilities in relatable human empathy. His reward is not wealth or recognition, but the temporary quiet that descends after order is restored. This quiet is fragile, always threatened by the next overt act of predatory behavior noticed during his daily existence. He remains a solitary sentinel, perpetually waiting for the next sign that the scales have tipped too far, understanding that his unique capacity for violence is the only true currency left in the fight against those who operate outside the law's slow reach. The recurring motif of time, precisely measured and relentlessly tracked by McCall, serves as a powerful metaphor for his psychological state. He lives in measured increments, because the large, amorphous span of a normal life seems forever denied to him. This obsession with seconds and minutes is displayed during his preparation for combat, not just counting down his opponents, but visually registering the passage of time on a watch or clock during quiet moments, as if auditing his own existence. This quantification stands in sharp contrast to the chaos he unleashes, suggesting a deep-seated need to control something when the moral landscape around him is utterly uncontrollable. His genius for prediction hinges on recognizing patterns, and time is the most fundamental pattern of all. The depiction of Terry's environment, the harsh neon lighting of the urban night juxtaposed with the quiet desperation of the diner, highlights the specific societal cracks McCall targets. These are not high-level political conspiracies. These are small-scale tyrannies flourishing in the blind spots of the established order. Terry's innocence is not pristine. She is street-smart and hardened, yet fundamentally broken by systemic exploitation. McCall's inability to accept her compromise is rooted in his own past. Compromises made under orders. He refuses to allow another soul under his protective gaze to submit to a life of coerced servitude. When McCall interacts with the DIA contacts, the tension is often rooted in shared history, the silent language between veterans of clandestine operations. Characters like York, who succumb to greed, serve as cautionary tales of what happens when highly specialized operatives lack an internal moral governor. McCall's decision to operate independently is also a rejection of bureaucratic inefficiency. He has seen firsthand how layers of command and oversight can stall necessary, immediate action, allowing evil to thrive in the bureaucratic delay. His efficiency is directly proportional to his autonomy. The emotional core of the film is built on McCall's self-imposed isolation. He is not lonely in the common sense. He chooses solitude to protect others from the inevitable fallout of his life. His relationship with his wife's memory, alluded to through photographs and quiet rituals, provides the impetus for his desire for normalcy, yet simultaneously reinforces why he cannot have it. He lives to honor a life that was predicated on peace, a peace he forfeited long ago. Therefore, every violent act is an inverted tribute, a brutal defense of the domestic tranquility he can no longer personally inhabit. The climax taking place in the unfinished structure is visually symbolic of McCall's current life, a place of potential, halted growth, and exposed foundations. He is fighting within a shell of what could be a productive American life, using the skeletal framework of industry against those who prey on the vulnerable. Fuqua frames these final moments not as a glorious victory, but as necessary, exhaustive surgery. When the dust settles, McCall is not celebrating. He is assessing damage, both external and internal, already anticipating the exhaustion that precedes the next call to duty. He has temporarily quieted one corner of the world, but the silence is always transient, serving only to sharpen his awareness of the next imbalance waiting to surface. The concept of the equalizer is fundamentally tied to an existential exhaustion that Denzel Washington masterfully projects. McCall is not fueled by righteous anger in the contemporary sense. Rather, he is driven by a profound fatigue with enduring injustice. His movements, even when swift, carry the weight of decades spent navigating moral ambiguity. This is subtly communicated in his posture. He rarely relaxes fully, suggesting that his body remains perpetually coiled, a machine designed for threat mitigation that cannot power down. The narrative cleverly uses his job at Home Depot, a place dedicated to structure, improvement, and consumer predictability, as the perfect camouflage for a man who deals in raw, unpredictable disorder. He is surrounded by the tools of domestic repair while specializing in human deconstruction. The relationship with Terry's exploitation is not simply a plot device, but an activation switch for a specific, highly specialized skill set that has lain dormant. The Russian syndicate represents an easily identifiable evil, organized, predatory, and arrogant, making them a perfect target for McCall's black-and-white moral calculus developed during his government service. They operate on the assumption that money and fear can silence accountability, a fallacy McCall is uniquely equipped to destroy. When he systematically gathers information, hacking into servers, and meticulously mapping out their supply lines, it mirrors the preparation phase of a complex intelligence operation, confirming that his mind has never truly left the DIA, only his physical assignment. Melissa Leo's Susan Plummer functions as the keeper of McCall's official biography, the person who witnessed the creation of the ghost operative. Her hesitation in helping him is a professional acknowledgement of the catastrophic risk he poses to his carefully constructed anonymity. Their interactions are dialogues between two people who share a history steeped in necessary lies. When she provides him with encrypted access, there's a palpable sense of complicity and worry. She knows that once the system recognizes McCall as active, the hounds will inevitably be sent, including those from his own former agency, who might view him as a rogue liability rather than a vigilante. The film's commitment to realistic, impactful violence, what some might term concussive realism, serves to underscore the stakes. There is no clean ballet of destruction. Every calculated blow McCall lands has a visceral impact, leaving him visibly strained. This physical toll prevents the audience from viewing him as invincible. He wins through superior strategy, planning, and timing, not inherent invulnerability. The clock-stopping sequences are not about slowing the world down, but about accelerating his own processing speed until he exists outside the normal flow of cause and effect relative to his targets. This intense focus is his sanctuary, the only place where his immense capacity feels appropriately channeled, offering a temporary, violent form of existential satisfaction that transcends mere heroism. He is operating on a self-imposed mandate, finding a terrible peace in the execution of necessary finality. The psychological toll of McCall's double life is most keenly felt in the silences that punctuate his days. These moments, often spent staring out of his apartment window or methodically arranging items on his workbench, reveal a profound internal loneliness that transcends physical isolation. He carries the ghosts of missions past, the collateral damage, the necessary betrayals, and these memories dictate his current, minimalist existence. The books he reads are not casual pastimes, but tools for self-regulation, attempts to anchor himself to enduring human truths while engaging in transient, destructive acts. The philosophical weight of figures like Camus, who grappled with the absurd, aligns perfectly with McCall's predicament. He is an agent of imposed order in an inherently chaotic and often meaningless world of human predation. The construction of the antagonist, Teddy, is crucial because he represents the institutionalization of the very evil McCall fled. Teddy is not a disorganized thug. He is a professional executor, operating within a corporate structure of vice. This elevates the conflict from a simple rescue mission to a necessary pruning of a deeply rooted organizational cancer. Teddy's arrogance stems from his faith in the system that employs him, the hierarchy, the presumed impenetrability of the syndicate. McCall's genius lies in attacking the systemic weaknesses, not just the individuals. By targeting financial records and communications, McCall undermines Teddy's authority and exposes the organization's vulnerabilities, forcing Teddy into an increasingly desperate, personal confrontation. The atmosphere surrounding Susan Plummer's involvement is thick with unspoken history and professional jeopardy. She understands that granting McCall access to surveillance data is tantamount to setting off a controlled demolition within the intelligence community's classified zones. Her actions are not betrayals of her country, but a reassertion of a higher, pre-governmental code of ethics that both she and McCall once tentatively followed. The tension in their infrequent meetings is that of former comrades who know exactly how deep the rot goes, understanding that true accountability often lies outside the jurisdiction of official channels. The film's editing further emphasizes McCall's fractured reality. Transitions are often abrupt, from the slow, almost meditative focus on tying a perfect knot to the sudden, explosive reality of combat. This reflects the constant, instantaneous shift required in his mental state. One moment, a helpful, quiet neighbor. The next, a lethal predator, calculating trajectory and impact force. The environments he chooses for confrontation, the semi-finished warehouse, the utilitarian back alleys, are intentionally devoid of comfort or civilian oversight, spaces where the rules of civilized engagement are suspended, allowing his unique, highly trained skill set to operate without unnecessary constraint or moral negotiation. He seeks environments where his past life is an asset, not a liability. His final moments of calm are derived not from happiness, but from the cessation of immediate, glaring imbalance, a temporary equilibrium achieved through extraordinary, singular effort. The quiet dignity McCall exhibits is less about stoicism and more about self-preservation. Expressing overt emotion would invite the chaos he is desperately trying to wall off from his core being. His actions, though heroic by external standards, feel like obligations fulfilled in a deeply personal ledger. When he cleans his weapons or meticulously repairs a small item in the hardware store, he is enacting a form of behavioral therapy, seeking repetitive, solvable problems to momentarily drown out the intractable moral problems of his past and present. This internal conflict, the desire for the simple life symbolized by his late wife and the inescapable pull of his formidable abilities, is the true engine of the narrative. He is a man perpetually mourning the normalcy he traded for specialized competence. The Russian enforcers he confronts initially are deliberately painted as brutal, unthinking extensions of unchecked greed, designed to provoke the visceral, protective response in McCall. Their casual cruelty towards Terry serves as the perfect moral litmus test. They represent the antithesis of the order McCall seeks to uphold. They take without permission, inflict pain without cause, and view human life as a disposable commodity. By systematically dismantling them, McCall is not just seeking revenge for Terry. He is purging the immediate environment of the cancer that symbolizes the uncontrolled disorder he fought against in his government capacity, but which he could never truly eradicate from within the system itself. The confrontation with Dave York, the former colleague turned mercenary, injects a necessary dose of professional bitterness into the climax. York embodies the path McCall narrowly avoided, selling elite skills to the highest bidder, stripping them of any moral compass. Their fight is imbued with a sorrowful recognition. They both know the capabilities required to reach this level of lethality, and in fighting each other, they are fighting over the definition of integrity in a world that abandoned honorable service. McCall defeats York not merely by being physically superior, but by adhering to the phantom code of loyalty that York discarded for transactional gain. Fuqua's visual language elevates these conflicts beyond mere choreography. The close-ups on McCall's hands, whether assembling a tool or applying a tourniquet, emphasize the tactile reality of his deadly expertise. There is an almost liturgical quality to his preparation. He is not just getting ready to fight. He is preparing the sacrament of his own specific justice. The final warehouse sequence is shot to feel claustrophobic and dangerous, deliberately stripping McCall of the environmental advantage he usually engineers. He must rely purely on instinct and the precise application of force against an opponent who understands his methodology. When the battle concludes, the quiet aftermath is heavy, suggesting not victory, but survival, a brief reprieve before the inevitable emergence of the next imbalance, requiring the application of his terrible, necessary gifts. He remains a necessary anomaly, forever on call to the shadows. The film's structure is that of a slow-burn fuse, leading to an inevitable, sharp detonation. McCall operates with the patience of a man who has literally nothing left to lose but his carefully constructed anonymity. This patience is a weapon in itself, contrasting starkly with the impulsive aggression of the criminals he pursues. He observes, absorbs data, and waits for the precise moment when his intervention will yield maximum systemic damage to the opposition while minimizing his own exposure. This methodical approach speaks to a deeply ingrained understanding of operational security, a habit he cannot shed, even when operating entirely outside official jurisdiction. Terry's character, despite her limited screen time, functions as a powerful moral anchor because she represents the potential for renewal that McCall believes is lost to himself. Her fragility, juxtaposed with the hardened reality of her profession, evokes a protective instinct that overrides his ingrained directive to remain invisible. When he commits to helping her, it is an explicit choice to trade his carefully cultivated peace for the risk of exposure. This choice is fueled by the recognition that true stillness is only possible when immediate, acute evil is neutralized, even if that neutralization requires profound violence. He is seeking external validation for his continued existence by actively practicing a purified form of the duty he once performed for a compromised entity. The internal dialogue within the intelligence community regarding McCall's reappearance is subtle but significant. Susan Plummer's concern is not just for McCall's safety, but for the bureaucratic nightmare his UN-sanctioned actions create. He is a loose cannon operating with high-level intelligence knowledge, and to the system, he is a threat of exposure, regardless of the morality of his targets. This underscores the central conflict. The legitimate structures are too slow, too compromised, or too constrained by rules to handle the rot at the street level, forcing the emergence of figures like McCall who operate outside those very structures. The thematic juxtaposition between the tools of domesticity and the instruments of lethality is a consistent visual thread. The hardware store setting provides a rich tapestry of ordinary objects transformed into instruments of calculated destruction. A simple cable tie becomes a precise restraint. A powerful light source becomes a disorienting weapon. This reinforces the idea that McCall is not merely reacting. He is applying specialized knowledge to readily available resources. He weaponizes the infrastructure of normal life against those who seek to destroy it. This narrative technique grounds the extraordinary nature of his abilities within a recognizably mundane setting, making his acts of violence feel both necessary and tragically out of place. Ultimately, the satisfaction derived from the Equalizer is not the catharsis of seeing a villain punished, but the acknowledgement of an imperfect system being momentarily corrected by an imperfect agent. McCall does not achieve enlightenment or permanent retirement through his actions. He merely recalibrates the scales, buying a small pocket of quietude for a brief period. His existence is defined by this cycle: quiet observation, sudden violent intervention, followed by a necessary, temporary retreat back into the guise of insignificance, waiting for the next time his unique, burdensome skill set is required to restore a fragile balance. The film continually emphasizes that McCall's unique effectiveness is inextricably linked to his enforced detachment from genuine human connection, a state mirrored by the very nature of his former intelligence work. His meticulous planning is not just about tactics, it is a psychological barrier. By reducing every confrontation to a set of quantifiable variables, time, distance, force, he avoids engaging with the emotional gravity of taking a life, even that of a clear villain. This cognitive dissociation is his primary survival mechanism, allowing him to execute tasks that would paralyze a less disciplined operative. When he stalks his targets, the silence surrounding him is the silence of a vacuum, a space where personal sentiment cannot penetrate the operational imperative. Terry's situation represents a final, desperate attempt by McCall to connect with the simple, good life he lost. Her vulnerability strips away the layers of geopolitical maneuvering that characterized his DIA career, presenting him with an uncomplicated moral equation: protect the weak from the unequivocally wicked. This simplicity is intoxicating for a man who spent years navigating shades of gray mandated by national interest. His decision to involve Susan Plummer, a relic of his former life, is a calculated risk taken because only someone within that framework can truly understand the depth of the organization he is challenging and provide the necessary institutional blind spots he requires. Plummer's silent approval is a form of reluctant recognition that some battles cannot wait for bureaucratic clearance. The contrast between the highly sophisticated, global reach of the Russian syndicate and the localized, almost primitive nature of McCall's justice is a key thematic element. The syndicate relies on infrastructure, communication networks, and legal leverage that McCall systematically dismantles by operating purely in the analog realm, using brute force, physical surveillance, and mechanical traps. He forces them out of their sophisticated web and into a direct, physical contest where his mastery of applied physics and close-quarters combat renders their organizational might obsolete. This highlights a commentary on modern crime, that even the most complex criminal enterprises remain vulnerable to a single, perfectly trained and motivated individual who chooses to operate outside the grid. Fuqua's visual storytelling often frames McCall not as a traditional hero basking in the light, but as a necessary shadow figure. The lighting in the key action sequences often keeps his face partially obscured or cast in deep shadow, suggesting that his true identity, the operative, must remain hidden even from the audience who roots for him. This reinforces the idea that his work is inherently unsavory. It is a necessary filth that must be cleansed without acknowledgement. His heroism is purely functional, devoid of ego or public acclaim. When he walks away from the final scene, disappearing back into the urban flow, it is the final confirmation of his true role, a force of correction that must remain anonymous to ensure its continuing viability. He finds his peace not in victory parades, but in the temporary absence of suffering he has engineered. The enduring melancholy that permeates Robert McCall's character stems from the fact that his skills are intrinsically tied to destruction, yet his soul yearns for creation and permanence. The items he tends to in his hardware store job, bags of cement, freshly cut lumber, organized shelving, represent the tangible, honest structures he wishes he could build in his own life. These routines are rituals against the chaos his past necessitates. When he calculates the exact time needed to subdue a threat, he is applying the same meticulousness he would use to measure twice before cutting wood, revealing that the discipline remains, only the application has shifted from construction to cessation. This internalization of his past is what makes Washington's performance so compelling. The weariness is not simply from fighting, but from the continuous, conscious effort required to contain the violence within him until a moral justification forces its release. The Russian organization's reach, which extends from the brothels of Boston to the high halls of international crime, serves as a perfect mirror for the type of shadowy, transnational threats McCall dealt with in the DIA. He understands their infrastructure because he helped build the framework that allowed such entities to operate with impunity. This intimate knowledge allows him to strike with surgical precision, bypassing superficial security to target the organizational heart. Teddy, as the primary enforcer, is a grim reflection of McCall's own past, albeit one utterly devoid of the latent conscience McCall retains. Teddy executes with arrogance. McCall executes with exhausted necessity, a crucial moral differentiator that justifies his vigilante status within the film's internal logic. Susan Plummer's role extends beyond simple exposition. She represents the last official tie to the life McCall abandoned, and, in a sense, the only one who judges his actions with the full context of his training. Her fear is rooted in knowing precisely what McCall is capable of, and the inevitable retaliation that his high-profile dismantling of Pushkin's operations will draw from unseen intelligence factions. When she risks her career to offer him a piece of information, it is an act of profound professional loyalty, recognizing that the rules have changed and that sometimes an unofficial operator is the only entity capable of enforcing true justice where the official mandates fail or become corrupted. The aesthetic of the film often juxtaposes the clean, bright world of suburban conformity with the grimy, hidden spaces where McCall conducts his business. This visual contrast underscores the film's central thesis, that the facade of order in modern society is thin, masking pervasive, organized cruelty. McCall moves through these shadows, not because he prefers them, but because that is where the rot festers, and that is where the conventional tools of law enforcement are ineffective. His victory is not about restoring a lawful society, but about imposing a brief, brutal order on the spaces society pretends do not exist. He is the necessary anomaly, the self-appointed custodian of the moral fringes, forever doomed to seek quietude through loud, definitive action. The true weight of McCall's existence is illuminated by his meticulous attention to the mundane details of life after the violence subsides. He doesn't immediately seek repose or bask in his successful execution of justice. Instead, the immediate aftermath of a confrontation often finds him returning to the quiet rituals, cleaning the residue of violence from his hands, perhaps replacing a broken item at the hardware store, or ensuring his reading material is perfectly aligned. This post-action composure is not apathy. It's a desperate attempt to re-anchor himself to the rhythm of normalcy before the adrenaline fades and the existential dread, the haunting reality of what he is, creeps back in. He finds authenticity only in the moment of action, yet craves the serenity of the stillness he can only momentarily purchase with bloodshed. The fleeting moments shared with Terry are powerful because they offer McCall a glimpse of genuine, uncoerced human gratitude, something his previous service rarely afforded him. He wasn't thanked for saving geopolitical stability. He was expected to deliver results silently. Terry's raw, fearful reliance on him, followed by her tentative, tearful relief, provides the emotional sustenance he denied himself for years. When he assures her she deserves better, he is essentially laying down the harsh terms of his own penance. He cannot have better, but he can ensure someone else has a chance to pursue it, thereby redeeming a sliver of his own compromised past. Her fate, and the fate of anyone he chooses to champion, becomes a surrogate for the life he can no longer live. Teddy's operational style contrasts McCall's mastery of improvisation with a rigid adherence to tactical doctrine, making his downfall feel inevitable. Teddy fights like a well-programmed machine, expecting predictable countermeasures. McCall, however, weaponizes the environment and psychological warfare, turning Teddy's reliance on structure against him. The chilling confidence Teddy projects that he is cleaning up a mess made by an obsolete operative is precisely what McCall exploits. McCall understands that arrogance blinds. He uses Teddy's certainty to lull him into underestimating the depth of McCall's commitment to finishing the job completely, often by utilizing unorthodox, almost theatrical, means to deliver the final blow, ensuring the message resonates beyond mere physical incapacitation. The narrative subtly suggests that McCall is not just fighting criminals, but fighting entropy, the natural tendency of systems, governments, organizations, communities, to decay into corruption and self-interest. His self-appointed role as the Equalizer is an attempt to locally reverse this decay. This responsibility is a crushing weight, as evidenced by the deep furrows etched around Washington's eyes even in repose. He knows that every time he steps out of the shadows, he risks attracting the attention of agencies like the one Susan Plummer represents, who view unpredictable morality as a greater threat than organized crime. His very existence proves that the official security apparatus has failed, making him both a savior and an unforgivable liability to the establishment he once served. The film leaves us with the somber understanding that for McCall there is no true retirement, only intervals between necessary wars. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the movie The Equalizer from 2014. Robert McCall, a man of quiet routine and meticulously ordered life, worked at a large home improvement store, moving pallets with a practiced, almost somber efficiency. He was a study in self-imposed exile, his past a closely guarded secret, though the subtle tension in his shoulders hinted at skills far beyond shelving laminate flooring. His days were marked by the simple ritual of a midnight cup of tea at the same diner, a place where the waitress, Terry, a young woman trying to make ends meet while pursuing dreams of singing, felt like the only real connection he maintained. Terry, though vibrant and ambitious, was caught in the undertow of a dangerous situation. She was being exploited by low-level Russian gangsters, forced into transactional sex work under the coercion of a brute named Slavy. When McCall learned of the severity of her plight, how she'd been beaten badly after trying to quit, the dam holding back his former identity began to crack. He didn't confront the men with rage. He approached them with the cold, measured logic of an expert strategist. He visited Slavy's establishment, attempting a calm negotiation, offering the money Terry owed. But when his offer was scornfully rejected and he was told to leave, McCall knew discussion was over. The subsequent confrontation was swift and brutal, a stark demonstration of skills honed in a life he desperately tried to leave behind. He didn't just beat Slavy, he systematically dismantled him, using the environment, a screwdriver, the precise application of pressure, with an almost surgical detachment that belied the violence of the act. This act, however, brought unwanted attention. The local Russian syndicate, realizing they had crossed a professional, sent in a heavy hitter, Teddy Rusk, a man who treated violence as a corporate restructuring exercise. Rusk was tasked with cleaning up the mess and finding out who McCall was. McCall, meanwhile, was beginning to reconnect with the world he abandoned, reaching out to an old contact, Dave York, a former operative from his time in the Defense Intelligence Agency. York, now working private security, confirmed McCall's worst fears. The cleanup crew sent after him were not local thugs, but highly trained assassins, and the operation was far larger than a simple protection racket. McCall's past as a highly effective black ops cleaner, a man the government deployed when deniability was paramount, was resurfacing. As Rusk's investigation closed in, leading him to uncover McCall's service records and phantom identity, McCall preemptively dismantled the network targeting him. He moved through their security systems with the ease of someone navigating their own home turf, disabling surveillance, severing lines of communication, and exposing their financial corruption. The climax occurred at an active construction site, a towering symbol of progress and potential ruin. McCall lured Rusk and his remaining elite team into this unfinished skyscraper. It became a tactical playground where McCall, using shadows, elevation, and improvised weaponry, rebar, tools, the structure itself, systematically neutralized the assassins one by one. He didn't seek to kill them quickly. He sought to enforce consequence, making each death fit the crime they represented. The final confrontation with Rusk was personal, a clash of two men utterly dedicated to their violent professions. McCall, though older, possessed an unmatched clarity of purpose derived from his sudden, if reluctant, rediscovery of moral obligation. After disabling Rusk, McCall left him for the authorities, ensuring that the paper trail he'd established would implicate the highest levels of the corrupt organization. In the aftermath, McCall returned to his quiet life, his ledger balanced for now. He checked in on Terry, ensuring she was safe and equipped to pursue her singing career independently, dropping a substantial envelope of cash, money he had acquired through necessity, not theft, to secure her future. He then returned to the familiar rhythm of his existence, a ghost once more, satisfied that he had provided the justice the flawed system could not, before disappearing back into the mundane tapestry of the everyday. Robert McCall was a man meticulously constructing a facade of normalcy, each action a deliberate step away from the shadows of his former life. His job at the big box store, pushing pallets, was penance, a way to earn small, honest dollars that contrasted sharply with the lethal efficiency he once deployed on behalf of agencies that preferred their dirty work to remain untraceable. He carried himself with a stillness that wasn't peaceful, but coiled, like a tightly wound spring, waiting for a specific, necessary tension to release it. Terry was the unintended catalyst, a beacon of fragile hope in the grim urban landscape. Her aspirations, the smoky, hopeful sound of her voice, trying to cut through the din of cheap bars, represented the kind of pure pursuit McCall felt he'd forfeited long ago. When he saw the bruising, the resignation in her eyes that went beyond mere exhaustion, something deep inside the retired operative recognized a familiar pattern of exploitation that official channels ignored. He was not just helping a girl, he was confronting the very chaos he'd spent years suppressing within himself. His initial visit to the Russian operation was not a moment of blind rage, but of calculated protocol adherence gone wrong. McCall, trained to neutralize threats with minimum collateral damage, offered a professional settlement. When Slavy, fueled by petty arrogance and misplaced loyalty to his superiors, scoffed at the offer and displayed contempt for Terry's suffering, the professional boundary dissolved. The subsequent scene in the cramped room was a demonstration of applied physics and anatomy, the shattering of a clavicle with a well-placed elbow, the methodical breaking of bones with a power tool. Each strike was precise, economical, and utterly devastating. He wasn't enjoying the violence. He was executing a difficult, necessary repair job on a broken system. Teddy Rusk, the cleanup specialist, was McCall's dark mirror. Rusk treated termination with the detached professionalism of a corporate auditor, his goal not vengeance, but operational security. He admired the work left behind at Slavy's site precisely because it signaled the involvement of someone who understood precision, a ghost from the same era of covert warfare. Rusk approached the investigation like an intelligence puzzle, tracing the anomalies in the system back to the source, the man who officially did not exist. McCall's re-engagement with Dave York was steeped in the unspoken language of long-dormant colleagues. York, whose life was now paved with high-end security contracts, saw the fear in McCall's eyes, the look of a man who thought he'd successfully buried his past, only to find it digging its way out. The confirmation that this wasn't just about petty crime, but a systemic threat emanating from elements McCall himself had once policed, forced him fully back into the role he'd sworn off. He wasn't seeking action. Action was seeking him, demanding resolution. The preparation phase was a masterpiece of counter-surveillance. McCall didn't hack the systems. He understood their logic, moving through the digital landscape with the same invisibility he moved through physical darkness. He systematically crippled the syndicate's ability to coordinate, turning their reliance on technology into a vulnerability. The final act, staged in the skeleton of a high-rise under construction, was McCall's return to his element. He navigated the scaffolding and concrete beams as if they were familiar terrain. The battle against Rusk's remaining men wasn't a brawl. It was a series of chess moves played out across 3 dimensions. He used the environment brilliantly, dropping debris, using hanging wires as trip hazards, turning the tools of honest labor into instruments of swift judgment. Facing Rusk, McCall exhibited a cold certainty. Rusk fought with the efficiency of a hired gun. McCall fought with the moral imperative of a man correcting an existential error. When Rusk was finally broken, McCall didn't linger. He ensured the evidence was planted, the right names tagged, the paper trail leading up the hierarchy, so that the bureaucratic machine Rusk served would choke on its own corruption. Leaving the scene, The quiet satisfaction wasn't triumphant. It was the quiet relief of a burden momentarily lifted. His final gesture toward Terry, ensuring her financial stability and safety, an anonymous patron of her artistic endeavor, was the only true atonement he could offer. He walked back into the pre-dawn streets, not as a hero but as a necessary correction, melting seamlessly back into the anonymity from which he'd been unwillingly drawn. The world had one less pocket of danger, and Robert McCall, the man who always balanced the scales, was once again just a shadow waiting for his next cup of tea. McCall's existence before Terry was a monochrome existence, defined by routine designed to prevent thought. He inventoried supplies at the Home Mart with the same dedication he once used to inventory potential hostile assets. The meticulous arrangement of items on shelves mirrored the rigid control he exerted over his own internal landscape, an attempt to keep the ghosts of countless classified extractions firmly locked away. He sought out the mundane because the mundane could not be killed, could not be compromised. Terry, however, possessed a raw vulnerability that bypassed his defenses. When he saw her in the diner, her eyes shadowed not just by lack of sleep, but by genuine fear. The routine faltered. He observed her, not with romantic interest, but with the detached assessment of a security analyst noting a critical system failure. Her singing wasn't polished, but it was honest, a sound untainted by the bureaucratic deceit that had defined his career in the DIA's clandestine operations unit. That honesty demanded protection, a task he hadn't officially undertaken in years. The confrontation with Slavy wasn't about the Russian mob's territory. It was about the sanctity of an individual's right to self-determination, a right McCall believed he had forfeited but saw in Terry's desperate plea. When he entered the back room, his mind mapped the exit routes, the potential weapons, the rusted shelving, the heavy toolbox. Slavy's casual cruelty, his refusal to see Terry as anything more than chattel, ignited a cold fury that bypassed adrenaline and went straight to operational necessity. The use of the power drill, not as a weapon of torture, but as a shocking tool for dismantling resistance, reflected McCall's philosophy. Efficiency over spectacle. He wasn't acting out. He was conducting a precise surgical removal of a toxic element. Teddy Rusk arrived like a plague specialist. He wasn't driven by anger, but by professional insult. A ghost had resurfaced, one who knew the protocols Rusk himself followed. Rusk's career was built on meticulous pattern recognition, tracing footprints left in the dark. When he found the remnants of Slavy's demise, Rusk recognized the signature, highly specialized